Well, we have just about a minute before we start. For everybody joining us, this is Patty Limerick and Bob Reynolds. Patty will be our master of ceremonies today. And in the comments, we are asking you all to introduce yourselves, tell us where you're from, tell us what watershed and airshed you were born in. We had some really cool discussions about how they're so interwoven and how it's difficult to pinpoint because they're so interconnected. But it's right about that time, Patty. So I will go ahead and pass on the microphone to you.
Alrighty. Well, thank you, everyone. What a pleasure to be here again. This is the last in our 4-part series, and we're all in good health, those of us who've been working on this. So if it is something that you would, not overstating that, I'm not overconfident about that, but if people do have ideas about things they would like to see in the integrating of these two topics, water and energy, maybe in 2021, by all means contact us and let us know what might serve humanity if we were to follow up with this topic. So we are continuing today with our vision of integration of the water and energy. I think had a really good round of that in all the sessions, but certainly in the third one, we had a lot of that knitting together. And the team that we have today is certainly going to keep that up. I am not going to give anything but the briefest remarks of starting off here because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for these opening introductions. As before, we'll have everyone speak, each panelist speak for somewhere in the 5 to 6 moments. Everybody knows the drill, that if there's problems with time, I put on the hat, and that solves that problem of time control. And then we will shift to a discussion among the group following up on their topics. I should give you the excellent news that the 5th speaker is coming from an angle that none of us anticipated. So throughout the whole project, we have been hoping to rattle assumptions, shake received wisdom, and really make an opening for fresh thought. And you'll see that we're certainly delivering on that in the course of this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to get started with our first speaker, who is Russ Sands. Russ Sands has worked in the water industry for 15 years. His career has included time spent ensuring water quality for Denver Water, managing water conservation and storm water programs for the city of Boulder, and working as a consultant on climate resilience and water issues. Now he is the section chief for the Colorado Water Conservation Board. He's currently working with leaders from each of Colorado's major river basins to update local and state analysis that will figure in the updating of the Colorado Water Plan. So that is what we are going to get well oriented to. And Russ, you're on.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody here for joining today. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm certainly excited about some of my fellow panelists today. I think I'm here to kind of set a little bit of the backdrop of at least kind of statewide planning from the CWCB or Colorado Water Conservation Board perspective. And I told these guys I tend to think in PowerPoint, so I'm just going to click through a few quick slides to accompany kind of where my head's at on some of this. But for background, in case you don't know, the Colorado Water Conservation Board has been around since 1937. There are just about 50 people doing a range of things, and I am in the water supply planning section of the group. And we are really kind of tasked with looking out and seeing what our future water needs are and working with stakeholders to try to meet those needs across all of the areas that are covered in the water plan, including in environment, municipal needs, and environmental needs as well. So I won't start with 1937. I will kind of fast forward in time to kind of the 2000s, early 2000s, when I really see a fundamental shift that we are still kind of living with today, where this is a picture of a Cheeseman Reservoir, and in that 2002 time period, it went from a pretty full reservoir to pretty depleted by a significant drought in 2002, 2003, and we also had what, at least today, as I understand it, as of maybe this morning, still stands as the biggest fire in the state, with the Hayman fire. And of course, now we're facing several fires across the state, and this somewhat infamous quote by former Governor Owens probably rings true for how we feel today, but it certainly set the tone for how we would think about water planning and for many of the planning efforts. So the statewide water supply initiative, often called SWASI, the first effort was done in 2004, and that looked out just to 2030. We always are trying to crystal ball the future, but it's harder the farther you get out, of course, and inevitably the truth is somewhere in between. So you will hear me talk about a concept that we've delved into more of thinking about scenario planning rather than a specific point in time and a specific single water need. In 2005, you had the House Bill 1177, also called the Water for the 21st Century Act, that created these crazy thing called roundtables with the really these stakeholder groups, these grassroots stakeholder groups from across the state that represent each of the major river basins, and also there's a carve out for the metro. And these folks are really critical to helping us think through and really address our future challenges, because the basins really help develop the projects. And they are our stakeholders, friends, and certainly my heart goes out to those that are dealing with the fires at this time across the state and drought. It's 2020 has been a rough year for all of us, and we're only doubling down on that. I will also note that in 2007 we did an update. It was really phase 2 of SWASI, still looking out to 2030, but started to bring in a little bit more of getting a feel for some of the environmental needs. And in SWASI 2010, that was kind of the last report pre-water plan, and it looked out to 2050. We estimated some of those numbers, so they may not have been as accurate. We're increasingly trying to increase accuracy and get better data. But then in 2013, as we were thinking about a draft of a new update to SWASI, Governor Hickenlooper really came and said, hey, we need to have a bigger vision for this water plan, and we have all the tools we need to work together and really collaborate to do this. So that mandate went out, and in 2015, along with some great work from the Basin Roundtables to develop local plans or basin implementation plans, which in some ways rolled up into the water plan. We launched the water plan, CWCB, in conjunction with a lot of our partner agencies and stakeholders across the state, with 30,000 comments, got the water plan. And one of the things that's in there that was developed from our stakeholders was this concept of scenario planning and looking out at these 5 different futures. And as we've thought about updating the water plan, we really realized that this SWASI, this technical analysis, and then the basin implementation plans and the comprehensive update to the water plan itself are really just intricately connected, and we need to think of them as a whole. So as we've kind of gone through this process, we've rebranded the statewide water supply initiative as the analysis and technical update to the Colorado Water Plan, and that is the first step. You will see, and I know this is small, but you're welcome, this is all online, but this report came out at the end of 2019. We will be refining it through the process, and so we'll have a little bit slightly enhanced data in the water plan when it comes out in 2022. But right now, we're right in the heart of working with the Basin Roundtables and even with staff and other partner agencies to kind of contemplate how this all rolls up into the water plan itself. And you will see that depending on the scenario, we have future gaps, future water needs up to 750,000 acre feet. And so the changes across these scenarios are extreme. And I will end with just saying 2 things. The analysis and technical update does a few new things. We try to put environment and ag and muni needs all on equal footing. It's also the first update to comprehensively include climate change. And in 3 of the 5 scenarios, you'll see that we have climate change built in with that much higher end on the upper, the last 2 scenarios. And those have dramatic effects on future water needs, as does population. And this is my last slide here, but I will just say that we see climate and population as 2 very strong signals that come through as predictors of what our future needs are. And so this graph is somewhat confusing, but basically lays out the 5 scenarios in comparison to SWASI 2010. You'll see our data has changed a little bit as far as our population projections. That's in part by working with our partner who's on this panel in the State Demographer's Office to get better population projections and thinking about some of the impacts that may not have been realized from the 2008 economic downturn. But either way, I think I will leave it there for our other panelists to jump in. But of course, energy is connected to water and water is connected to energy, and it's a common thread across all the work we do.
Great, thank you so much, Russ. Our next speaker is Jordan Mechnick, and he is the lead energy, water, land analyst for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He's also a member of the Strategic Energy Analysis Center's Systems modeling team within the resources and sustainability group. A great blessing that he didn't put those in as acronyms and actually spelled those out. That really helped quite a bit here for me. And his areas of expertise, all of them in play in the next few minutes here, include systems modeling of energy and water infrastructure interactions, renewable powered water treatment systems, meta-analysis of diverse data sets, and low impact renewable energy development. So here's Jordan.
Thank you very much, Patty, and thank you to everybody who's here today. I am here primarily to give a background and a little bit more foundation about the current status of our energy sector today, as well as some glimpses into what the energy sector might look like going forward and what we can expect to see and how it might affect not only our day-to-day life and our energy sector, but also our water sector. So I've been at the lab for about 11 years now. When I first joined the lab, I was sort of hired on as the water guy, and many people were a bit surprised as why does the energy lab need a water guy? Because it wasn't necessarily related to hydro, but it's water resources. And I think slowly, as we've really seen the momentum and interest in this topic pick up, everyone has very clearly realized that our energy sector, is dependent upon reliable sources of water, and our water infrastructure is very dependent upon a reliable energy system as well. So much of my time at the lab thus far has been focused on, initially it was actually integrating water resources into our flagship energy models. So looking at, as we look out into the future, the year 2030, 2040, 2050 and beyond, how water and water availability might affect how the power sector would develop and where we can build certain types of technologies, et cetera. And so that has been a major focus of my initial work at the lab. More recently, in the last few years, much of my effort has been focused on the opposite end of the equation, the energy for water side of things, as we start to realize that as many places move into desalination or the treatment of alternative water resources like produced water from oil and gas or brackish groundwater, these can be very energy intensive. And it's a way in which something that we need to address as we go forward, and we need to tap into more of these alternative water resources. We need to find a way to reduce the energy intensity of those, the cost of those, and just be more efficient in how we're treating and transporting our water. Some of the insights that I can talk about later as well also look at what are the trends and what are the things that we can expect to see going forward. And we've already established, and I think throughout the other presentations, you've seen how energy and water are connected. Going forward, I think we're going to see some three different conflicting trends that are all going to be happening at the same time. One is we will see a slight decoupling of the dependency of energy and water, especially as it relates to the water requirements for the energy sector. As we move from a transition from existing coal, natural gas, and nuclear power plants to more PV and wind technologies, PV and wind technologies don't require water for operations. And so there we'll see a reduction in water and thus a decoupling, if you will, of those connections between energy and water on that front. On the other side, though, as we look at the energy for water, as we tap into more desalination opportunities, as we treat more and more alternative water resources, as we transport more water, we will see an increase in the energy requirements for our water infrastructure. The third piece that ties into that last element as well is the integration. So I think this will be probably the most significant change that we'll see, is that we'll see greater integration of our water treatment facilities and water treatment infrastructure interacting with our energy infrastructure. So this might mean that our water treatment facilities will operate more flexibly, ramping up and down to match price fluctuations or changes in the availability of electricity. If we have more variable PV and wind on the grid, we might see more ramping up and ramping down of that water infrastructure. We'll also see similarly see power plants ramping up and ramping down to accommodate the variable PV and wind loads that we'll have on the grid, which again will then change their water requirements and water usage. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. The hat was premature, so that was perfect. Thank you very much. And in fact, really, you have lived your life to be at this conference. I'm just going to say that you're bringing those issues together is really well, just wonderful that you put so many years into that. Now we're going to move on to a topic that we have not really gone at as much as hardly mentioned in some ways over the last sessions, and that is groundwater. So we're very fortunate to have Peter Barkman, who is senior hydrologist at the Colorado Geological Survey, where he conducts regional water resource investigations, environmental assessments, and manages the groundwater resources program. He is the co-author on numerous maps and reports, including the award-winning Groundwater Atlas of Colorado, which he is now working to update to an entirely web-based format. So here he is. Here's Peter.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you everybody for indulging me on talking about groundwater. I grew up in the Rio Grande watershed in northern New Mexico, and as a kid I'd go out and divert water from the acequia that went through our property. And in my bare feet I would irrigate our orchard and alfalfa fields. So my feet have always been planted in water and dirt. And as such, I landed as a geologist and was very lucky to be at the Colorado Geological Survey, which is a non-regulatory state agency responsible for educating the public and gathering data on critical resources. And groundwater is one of those. And as this conference evolved, I was rather stubborn about saying, you know, groundwater has a very special place relative to energy, and really wanted to bring that up as part of this. And as Patty said, it's been a little bit neglected, but it's really closely tied to energy. And groundwater's everywhere. It's beneath our feet wherever you are. It can't be seen. It's not always easy to get to. It takes energy to pump it to the surface to use. In many places, it's not usable because of water quality, and it takes energy to purify it so you can use it where the quality isn't great. Colorado's blessed with a wide variety of different geologic materials that form aquifers: unconsolidated alluvium, consolidated bedrock, fractured crystalline rock, volcanic materials, and even some cave systems, which are the closest you might get to underground rivers. So we have this wide variety and a very colorful mosaic across the state. And you know, we might ask, why is it so important if less than 20% of the population uses groundwater right now? But I think we need to keep in mind that a lot of the population growth is pushing people away from our urban areas that have centralized water systems. And so people are becoming more reliant on groundwater in some of these more distant areas. It's easy to work remote from an urban area because you can be on the internet with your work, and so, but you can have a well, you need groundwater. So there is a growing reliance in parts of the state where it wasn't in the past. The other thing, and this has come up in some of the planning for the Colorado Water Plan, we have a huge need for storage for water, and there's a lot of potential for storage in our aquifer systems, and that's been looked at over the past 10, 15 years. And you know, it's something that really needs to be kept in the limelight, is where would we store water in our aquifers, and how do we do it, the infrastructure to do it, the energy it takes to get the water to and out of those aquifers. So that's a very important aspect of our aquifers. The other thing that to keep in mind with our aquifers is many of them are intimately tied with energy resources. Many of our aquifers are oil and gas reservoirs at depth. The Dakota Aquifer, which crops out at the Hogback here in the metro area, is a prime oil and gas producer in the Denver Julesburg Basin. Other aquifers, such as the Laramie Fox Hills, are host uranium deposits. So here we tie our aquifers with an energy resource. And in other areas, groundwater has to be extracted in order to produce energy. Geothermal energy, that's groundwater. It's just hotter than you would use it at your tap. We've also looked at aquifers as sites for carbon sequestration. Last week, we heard from Excel that that's one of the tools in the kit for managing carbon dioxide from our coal and gas electric production. We're looking at deep saline aquifers for injecting carbon dioxide. Again, we're looking at our aquifers. So they're really, you cannot separate them from energy. And the Colorado's Geological Survey is part of its task to educate the public and bring data, geologic data out for mass consumption and to make it available to people. We had done an atlas back in 2003 that was a folio. And both CWCB and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment recognize the need to update that as a web base. We're moving into the 21st century. So we were funded by both agencies to create a web-based atlas, which is online, and I'll be pasting the link in the chat box here. And it has basic information to educate people, as well as a web map with 400 layers of data, which is a little clunky. We're working on making that more manageable, and downloadable data. And we've done this as a way to bring groundwater to the forefront and allow people to understand our precious aquifers. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference and take a look at our atlas. I'm placing the link in the chat box right now.
Thank you so much, Peter. Up next, we have Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, I will let you do your fabulous introduction and let us know a little bit more about your background.
There you go. Super, thanks. My name is Elizabeth Garner, and I'm the state demographer for Colorado. And you'll see that I'm kind of the one sticking out. I don't have anything to do with directly with water or energy, but I am parts, demand for these resources are based on population in part for some of this stuff. So thought I'd just talk a little bit about population and how that's changing in the state and how that might fit into this energy and water discussion. So part of the goal, I think, with some of this is that we're looking at what are some of the big takeaways, or one of some differences that may not be aware of for folks in the state. And one of the big things is that population is growing at a slowing rate. And I don't know how many people believe that. But you can see that the black line on this chart is in 2019 and basically indicates that for the last 4 years, we've been slowing down in that growth with a peak growth in 2015. We increased by 67,000 people this last year. We can see that we haven't increased by over 100,000, really since this time period back in the 90s. And certainly some of the slowest growth in Colorado since about 2005. So I think it's really important to see that we are slowing down. The US as a whole also had its slowest growing year between 2018 and 2019. So if the US is slowing down, Colorado is going to be slowing down as well. We can see that our forecast right now is that we'll see a little bit of continued slow growth, especially related to COVID. But then you may be freaking out a little bit and see this increased growth that we're forecasting in the near term. But I will get into that in a little bit, but that's definitely driven by retirements in Colorado. So it's really important to understand that we are seeing this slowing growth, really driven because birth rates are slowing, death is increasing, primarily not necessarily due to COVID, but that's this year, that is. But just because we're older and we have a larger group of our population and age groups that have higher death rates. And then migration is slowing, and especially international migration has been slowing. So everything is slowing down in the US as well as in Colorado. The other big takeaway is that remember that everything is connected. Jobs, population, energy and water demand, public finance, all connected. And so, a lot of times we get the comment of, oh, if we could just slow population, if we could just slow population. And my big question to you is, can we just slow job growth? And that sometimes catches people off guard. But the point is, and you can see it in this graph, when we have stronger job growth, which is the blue bars, we have stronger net migration because jobs are people. And that is really important to remember, that jobs are people and housing units are where those jobs sleep at night. So when we're going into this discussion about potentially slowing growth, it's important to remember that we need to look at that relationship between jobs and population, but then also acknowledge the value of people. People are important. Consumer expenditures drive 70% of the economy. So if we're going to slow population, we need to be thinking about what that does to the economy and public finance. Jobs are, people are also workers. Workers are important to fill those jobs. So we can't have jobs and not people. So it's important, again, to see how those pieces come together. The other piece, and this is going to be a question kind of to my panelists, what we've seen in terms of growth in Colorado is that it's been very concentrated along the I-25 corridor. So between 2010 and 2018, or 2019 as well, all of the growth, 95% of it has been concentrated along the I-25 corridor. That actually may be a benefit for both water use as well as energy use, to have that concentrated growth. It might be more efficient to provide those resources in a concentrated format. What we can also see is that not all of Colorado has been growing. The red, orange, yellow counties are counties that are increasing. The shades of blue are counties that are declining. And we've got about 25% of our counties declining in population. So some of the things that I think that we can learn from each other is, how do we manage everything when we've got a declining population? How do you fund roads and bridges? How do you run schools and libraries and health centers? How do you fund infrastructure projects that might be for clean water if you've got a declining tax base and a declining population? Just because you've got a declining population doesn't mean that you don't need to improve your water systems. And we've certainly got those cases around the state where they cannot fund them with their current population. We're also getting older, and that's an important thing to take into account, because our aging population is actually also driving the economy. This shows an age distribution of the state. We can see a slowing of aging of our population and our young ends. Our peak population is kind of a 29-year-old, but we've got a lot of people moving into the 65 plus, so aging out of the labor force, which is actually going to create even more demand for workers, therefore people. So keep that in mind. This is all connected. Takeaway is, we're slowing, but we're growing. We're growing in the concentrated in the I-25 corridor. We're forecasting a lot of counties to either be flat or declines. And just for Russ's perspective, we're even forecasting slower growth out into the future simply because of also COVID. So now instead of 8.1 million by 2050, we're down to 7.9 million by 2050, which most people are probably cheering, but there will be some consequences from that. So I want to thank you very much for having me as part of the program today, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We are having an episode or two of the technical challenges of this format. I have lost my internet connection twice. Thank you, everybody, for carrying on without me. I appreciate that. And also, we have in the background from time to time the sound of a drill. So I have no idea where that could be coming from, but if you are trying to multitask and watch this and engage in some home repairs with a drill at the same time, stop that now. So, okay, we're moving on. Now, for our final opening set of remarks here, we have Dr. Mark Jensen. He is a professor of chemistry, and he is the Jerry and Tina Grandy University Chair in Nuclear Science and Engineering in Colorado School of Mines. So you heard the word nuclear there. His research interests are focused on the nuclear fuel cycle. So we are about to have just an interesting thought excursion where we think about the fact that the decarbonization of energy production is a huge priority, and a minimal use of water in energy production, that's a priority too. So what should we be thinking about nuclear energy? And here is Mark Jensen, who's going to exercise our minds. I think that, well, that's what everybody else has done, but maybe brace your minds for some real squat thrusts, I guess, at this point. So here we go. So Mark, thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Patty. So why would we ask a nuclear chemist to be part of this panel? I mean, in Colorado, there hasn't been an operating nuclear reactor making power for more than 30 years. And the one that we had at Fort St. Vrain didn't work very well, actually, for the 10 years it was operational. So, as Patty alluded to, I think one of the key things that defines the ethos of Colorado is that Coloradans have an idea and an ethos of stewardship for our natural resources and our environment, and how we use these well and appropriately. Now, different people have different ideas about what that stewardship means, but I think a general environmentalism is something that really defines Colorado. And, you know, you can see this when you think about things like our clean energy plan for the state. If you think about the fact that per capita, Coloradans use less electricity than 75% of other states in the country. So, you know, we have a real idea of conservation and using the environment wisely, and we're committed to using greener forms of energy, of trying to use water supplies well. So, and that's why I'm here today, actually, to talk about nuclear energy, because nuclear energy is really at an exciting juncture in the United States right now. In September, we're expecting the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to license the first new nuclear reactor design in years. And this would be a new small modular reactor, a nuclear reactor that's designed to come in small, relatively inexpensive prefabricated modules that get around a lot of the safety and cost issues of large gigawatt nuclear installations. And in fact, the first of these plants is scheduled to be built here in the Mountain West. It'll be built in Idaho and operated by a coalition of utilities in Utah. There's also a second brand new design for a micro nuclear reactor that is at the NRC right now and is being reviewed for its license. This new type of reactor would allow remote communities or remote industrial mining sites to have clean electricity for decades. You don't have to truck diesel fuel in and burn that. All these nuclear plants and the other 95 operating nuclear plants in the United States that provide 20% of our electricity do this while emitting very little in the way of greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Climate Accord used data to show that only offshore wind had lower life cycle CO2 emissions than nuclear energy. So the energy density of nuclear energy, its clean, its lack of CO2 emissions are real things that can add it to an energy mix. Now, with all the growth in solar and wind energy, especially in Colorado, why would Colorado even entertain the idea of using nuclear energy? Well, actually, even with all the growth in electrical generating capacity by renewable energy, actually in 2018, the last year we have numbers for states, despite the growth in renewable energy in Colorado, more than 88% of our electricity usage still came from burning fossil fuels. Now, with our plans, we'll do better than that, but we're not going to be able to achieve carbon neutral or 100% greenhouse gas reduced energy without other things in the mix, because energy storage is really expensive. And so this is a place that nuclear, and especially these new nuclear designs, can add to the energy future in states all around the country and Colorado. So thank you.
So now we get to go into a group discussion here. And I thought I might start with a question that we have not been pressed. We didn't really press it all for the first couple of sessions, but I thought I might just ask everybody to take up the question of what in your area and the items you were discussing, everybody on the panel return here, good. What is the issue, decision, challenge that carries the greatest sense of urgency in your judgment? If it does intersect, if it is at the point of intersection between water and energy, fine, but you could actually, if that's not where your mind goes, that's fine too. So could we just maybe go through the group, maybe in the reverse order of your speaking, and tell us where you see, boy, we don't have a lot of time to work this through. Where's the place? It can be one or two places where you think that's got to be something we get on fast. So Mark, how about if we go with you to switch the order?
Okay, I'll go with deep decarbonization across the energy landscape, not just electricity, but everything. And the way that affects water is that by keeping climate under control, we help preserve our snowpack and reduce evaporation and increase our water supply.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, how about you? You're muted still.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, you totally are. You're totally
okay. You know, I don't really know. I mean, I think the big point is understanding the value of people and how they fit into the economy. And I'm going to apologize. It is me that sounds like the drill. It's my stupid computer. The fan is on constantly. I'm about to lose it. So maybe I'll get a new computer at some point.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, that might be the most urgent thing when you think about
it. That is probably the most urgent piece for me as a new computer. But I think it really is just making sure that we understand the connection between population, water, energy, the economy, public finance, and how those all are really important to integrate together in terms of how we're going to fund any of this into the future.
Yeah, good point. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so now we're at Peter. Is here with us, Peter?
Hey, unmute. I would echo what Mark said on the decarbonization, because it's so critical what's happening with our water cycle, our hydrologic cycle of where the water's coming, evaporation, precipitation, distribution. Now, as a champion of aquifers, groundwater has some resilience to changing climate patterns, but still it has to be recharged. I also think just education of the public. I think we really need people to understand the water resources. We take it for granted, and it doesn't just appear at your tap. It takes a lot of effort to get it there, and people don't appreciate that.
Jordan. Jordan? Well, have we got Jordan here? Oh, there, Jordan. Oh, you're muted. I see where we're missing you here. We need you unmuted. We're still.
Is that better?
Oh, perfect. Absolutely. Yeah, great.
Okay, great. So from my perspective, the biggest urgency is the need for coordinated planning among the different energy and water infrastructure investments that we're going to make. When we build a new power plant, that'll last a minimum of 25 or 30 years. When we build water infrastructure, that'll last even longer. And it's much harder to retrofit systems to accommodate greater integration or differences and changes than it is to design it smart from the start. And so my greatest urgency is focused on making sure when we make energy investments or water infrastructure investments that we're taking into consideration the other sector and planning smartly.
Thank you. Russ.
Well, of course, I agree with all the great comments from my fellow panelists. I tend to, maybe this is hedging a bit too, but I think that, we need to bring everybody along together and find what we typically frame as these multi-purpose, multi-benefit projects that are going to help meet the most needs and cause be the most productive solutions that everybody can get on board with. And maybe we need to broaden the thought process around that to build in more thoughts around resilience and energy. But it's hard in today's climate, as Elizabeth was talking. I mean, I think a lot about just to not see the sense of urgency in just the economy. And if that's not a bit of a predictor for this kind of lower population growth and decreased tax base that we're seeing now, but as we're all scrapping for dollars to make projects happen that are quite honestly are necessary across the state, I think we have to find ways to pull together to make those projects happen that raise everyone up together.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in quickly a thought from a Western American historian, Richard White, who's a counterpart in Western history at Stanford, and he wrote years ago, he wrote in an essay, he said, planning, the problem with much of our circumstances in the West is that planning is boring. It's a boring world. And boring word. And he says that that planning, that boredom operates like scent for a skunk and drives people away. That there is the planners are meeting and we have a greater desire for stimulation and interesting. So he uses this great phrase, the modern world is forged amidst our inattention. So I'd like to hear, because planning is so intrinsic to everything we've been discussing, I don't happen to have the allergy that he describes and others, but I do think that for many, many citizens that we're going to go to an event where we're going to learn about planning, it doesn't get the pulse racing. And yet scenarios are pretty darn interesting. And people sell millions of copies of books with scenarios of the future. They're often called science fiction writers and so on. So I would like to have everybody who would choose to do this, just reflect for a moment on how to take the concept of planning and show it to the broader public with all of the energy and consequence that it actually carries. If that question makes sense to everybody, just accept a little bit of Richard White's premise, that is not a real zinger of a word and concept and activity. And do you have a story that would convey how extremely engaging, enlivening, consequential, nerve-wracking this thing called planning is?
I can jump in, Pat. I mean, great quote. I really like that. I often have to almost wonder too that, at least historically speaking, the extent to which some of that might have been intentional for any number of reasons, maybe because it's hard to plan together. And we have certainly seen that. And, one of my favorite quotes that came out, I think disparagingly, probably was the intent around the water plan, was that the governor at the time had done everything to kind of inoculate the water plan from any kind of negative feedback. And yet that is what we have to do. And it's incumbent upon us to make it exciting for people and engage people. And of course, now everybody's being asked for their time, and that's probably the most precious thing we have to offer. But as we look to update the plan, it's very much focused on how do we bring more people into the room. And to be honest, some of the comments are tough, and some of the, some of the feedback you get isn't always maybe what you expect. But I believe that by broadening that tent, bringing more people and getting them excited, meeting them where they're at, finding what excites them, we get a better product in the end that it makes us more resilient in the long term.
Good answer. Thank you. Anybody else? Jordan, I would assume.
Patty, I could add a little bit, the planning as far as how we develop our land and move forward is taken at the county level. And some of the counties in Colorado are taking a hard look at water and how you work it into your policies for development. Jefferson County is a good example where they've been looking at the foothills area of Jefferson County is relying on groundwater from fractured crystalline bedrock. And my virtual background is a panel gneiss and granite on I-70 that shows where we try to get our groundwater up here in Jefferson County. And the county is looking at that and working at a water policy that helps them guide development in this area. And I hope that other counties are doing the same. And it's a part of the path for getting planning into the process around water.
I think it's a great point. And Richard White, I don't think has attended a county commissioner's hearing where people are really shouting about planning, and that might change his angle on that. So Jordan, I'm thinking you might have a response on planning, and also of course, actually everybody else, Elizabeth too, and Mark.
Yeah, one thing to consider also is a sense of what can I actually control. And so, I think that plays an important role in determining participation and how much energy someone would actually put into a process if their voice will be heard or whatnot. I also think it also relates to inherent uncertainty that we face in the energy sector or in the water sector. For example, no one could have predicted the shale gas boom, for example, and that completely, revolutionized the trajectory that the energy sector was taking, from what we thought it was going to be 10 years ago. So that's an incredible example of how quickly things can change that you can't anticipate. And it can lead to a sense of, well, what did all that effort that I put into planning when it just got upended by a new development? And so I think in terms of developing, effective plans going forward, we need to build in that level of flexibility and the willingness to consider wildly, seemingly improbable events and how we might act in a way that really leaves no regrets.
That is so interesting because of course we're all obsessed with probability. And I love the fact that you have now said, well, you might put a little bit of obsession into improbability as well. I'm going to rip you off on that. That's a really, really good idea. So Elizabeth, planning, you just must be constantly in its company. So
yeah, absolutely. It's so funny because I'm a planner. This is what we do. But I think that the thing that gets confusing is that a plan doesn't have to be one number. And that's what I appreciate with the water plan is that they do have different scenarios that have different what ifs coming in, even the improbable what ifs come in there as well, because then it gets you to be thinking about what can you do at different stages. But I agree with you. I think the word plan is boring, unfortunately, for some people. For me, I love it. But I think that's why people have said sustainability was such a key word for a while. And then now it's resiliency. But all it means is good planning. Whenever you take it down to its nugget. People are trying to say, oh, now there's a roadmap. And I'm like, well, what does that mean to you? What is a roadmap? And they're like, well, it's a plan. I'm like, okay, so we're just fancying up the word, but I think, it is critical for everyone to put these plans together and have those different what if scenarios.
Great. So Peter, do you have anything, excuse me, Mark, not Peter. Mark, we haven't had you in this yet. So do you have anything you want to say quickly about planning and where you feel that has promise for the causes you support or where it gets in your way? Mark.
There. Okay.
Good.
Yeah, well, historically, I think of all the things we've talked about, nuclear energy has been the most planned and regulated. Water's got to be a close second, but nuclear energy is pretty regulated and pretty deeply planned. I think that's appropriate, and I wouldn't want to see less planning and regulation. So.
Okay. Well, good. Well, thank you. I'm going to just throw this in, and I don't want anyone to take the time to respond now, but I will return and bug you in the months to come, which is art and music and humor. And I just think there are forms of human expression that don't appear in this world of planning, or science fiction writers for that matter, to have forums and symposia, which every now and then will happen. But I just think there might be a range of that human expression and I will ask all of you that privately and separately on some other occasion. I would be interested in your thoughts about the integration of scientific expertise into planning, especially when there is such a premium on public participation, public input. what would be, if you could design the ideal scenario, you've got a session on planning for the future of water and energy, and you succeeded and you have many engaged citizens, how do you bring a couple of scientists or 10 scientists into that? Do they come in white lab coats? Does the audience fall silent or stand in respect? Or, well, probably not. We know it probably won't happen, but how do you bring the scientists into that conversation in a way that maximizes the benefit of their company? And I'm asking this because I forgot to say at the beginning that this whole forum is brought to us by the Colorado Scientific Society, and the role of science is really very central. Since I wanted to ask that question, I apparently forgot to thank the presidents of the Colorado Scientific Society at the beginning, but now I've just done that and said to you, what is the best way of integrating the testimony or the presence or the slides or the view graphs of scientists into these conversations about the future of water and energy?
Well, I could take a stab again. I guess I would say it does, in my mind, it comes down to maybe some of the things that are a thread through here, but language matters. I can't help but laugh a little because it reminds me a little bit of my kids going back to school and talking with the teachers, and they've clearly gone through all this training and they're using these synchronous and asynchronous and pedagogy. And I'm like, I don't think half the parents are tracking with what you're saying. And we lose people. When we talk about climate, you talk about representative concentration pathways, half the people have tuned out. And if they haven't already, because you said the word climate. So we have to break things down, and not in a demeaning way, I don't mean that at all, but in a way that just really gets to the things that matter to people and the heart, and talk about the ways that we can build. And I think that's why we have traction around these words like resilience maybe, and that's the popular thing instead of planning, because people can get behind it in a way that maybe planning just doesn't resonate. So I'm all for changing the way we speak in a way that best connects with people and helps them understand the urgency and the need and their role, and that Jordan's point's great, that their voice will be heard, and we certainly have to be intentional about making sure we're not asking for input if we're not going to use it, right?
Yeah, wonderful. These are wonderful comments. And I wouldn't mind a bit if someone, and Russ, if you want to take a quick minute or two, a second or two really on this, what is the training of scientists that would enhance that effectiveness? Your points about the use of choice of terms, the use of language and so on. How would
well, I mean, it's a good point. It's a double-edged sword, and I'm not sure that we can always get away from some of the, the terms of the terms. We struggle with that with legal terms, engineering terms. I will back up, Elizabeth, that as planning people, we probably geek out on that, just as legal people and engineering people get together and they geek out on their things, and that's fair too. But, I will give a shout out to folks like at Western Water Assessment and Jeff Lucas. I think that they've just, as we go out and speak, you can listen. I think it's all about listening. You hear and the feedback that you get, whether it's, I don't understand, you read the body language of people tuning out. Fair, everybody checks their phone, but you just see who's dropping off by attrition, or what questions, or hey, did you understand what we talked about afterwards, maybe post survey. And if people aren't getting it, we have to adapt, right? And we have to adapt together.
Great, wonderful point. So anybody else want to come in on this science and its most effective integration into these public discussions?
Yeah, I can interject just some experience that I've seen, and Russ mentioned the Water for the 21st Century and the roundtables that it was set up. And if you ever have a chance, you should go sit in on a roundtable meeting, because this was brilliance. Russ George stroke of brilliance on setting these up with these roundtables, and it's a fantastic venue for people, anybody, to go in and present ideas. And we've attended them as technical liaisons, and it's an open forum for people like myself. And we geologists are the worst for coming up with words that nobody can understand. We're terrible. But we can sit in there, and if we recognize that there's a need to talk about groundwater, geologic aspects, it's an open forum for doing that, and it works very well. I think, Russ, you could attest to what a successful operation roundtables have been, and I encourage anybody to go sit in. They're open.
Absolutely. I would say great point, Peter. And you remind me that sometimes the answer might be just shutting up and letting other people talk in the word and listening to how they talk about it, right?
I'm curious about if there is anything remotely like a counterpart in the state for energy roundtables. and I understand what Russ George set up was really, really different, really distinctive, but it just makes me think, wouldn't that be an interesting thing? I mean, of course I live in Boulder, Colorado, where we are chattering about energy all the time, but in a kind of monomaniacal, sorry to say that to my fellow citizens, but Captain Ahab-like way, just chatting and chatting and chatting about the white whale, which is municipalization. Good. And it brings decarbonization down to the ground. I get that and so on. But I just was thinking how fascinating to have energy roundtables that were modeled on the Colorado water roundtables. And Jordan, have you ever heard of any such thing? Or Elizabeth, have anybody ever heard of that sort of bringing civilians together for a deliberation on this resource that they're all using?
Yeah, Patty. You know, one thing that the Bighorn Institute had been doing in Colorado was bringing citizens together for a couple of weekends over a quarter or so. And they were ordinary citizens that were interested in energy, citizens that had jobs that were related to energy, and you know, the one that I was part of, there were probably, I'd say 30 to 40 citizens there talking about Colorado and its, you know, its energy needs and what makes sense.
So I totally agree and would join you in the shout out to Bighorn. And I have spoken to several of those, but I'm just thinking the Colorado water roundtables had a continuity and a persistence and a reach that Bighorn is spectacular, so there's no way I will ever join anyone saying anything negative about Bighorn. I won't be that person, but there's something that just strikes me as a real prototype in how those roundtables worked. And I'm just with Peter and Russ on that. So, okay, well, boy, we are really, we're going to go, we're just throwing everything out as a plan. We're going to stay on for 2 or 3 hours and keep chatting, and lunch will be served. Well, okay, no, not going to happen. So I'm thinking, I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you would inject into the whole system of public deliberation, of legislators' conduct or whatever, that would enhance long-term thinking, get us out of the, which in pandemic times, thinking beyond the panicked moment is really not a strong suit, but what data point or what short story of an experience would you want out there to get people to think, okay, water and energy, really important right now, but not so important because we have a virus and we don't have a vaccine. So we're going to go into short-term thinking about that. Hope it's short-term thinking about the vaccine. What would you inject to say, extend the time horizon in which you were thinking about water and energy? Inject is a weird term. I'm gonna say that's really weird. So let's think of it as a literal injection there. Yeah, please, Peter.
I'm afraid I'm just a little bit of a skeptic and cynic about this, because I think what it takes is, it takes almost a catastrophe to get things to happen. And you have to throw somebody out there with no water, no energy for them to understand that they take it for granted every day. And I think it comes back to education. And I think this is what's great about Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And what we're doing is we need to get the public to realize they can't take energy and water for granted like they always have. Bring it out there so it becomes on the forefront of people's minds, so we get our legislators to think about it. Not wait until it's a COVID pandemic. We always wait until it's a disaster. So I'm a cynic.
Well, thank you for that. That was a good forthright. Would anyone like to counter the temperament that he has a wonderful temperament. And I think what you said at the beginning about your being out on acequias, that's a really important part of who you are, that you have been right there in a very grounded way with that irrigated use of farming in New Mexico. Well, okay, so that's good. So you're a very cheerful person at heart. I know that, Peter, so I'm not going to be fooled by what you just did there. But does anyone want to counter that sense of we'll have to wait for crisis?
Maybe we don't have to wait till a Colorado crisis. I mean, we could look at another example. I think
Very good.
Right now in California, we're having some rolling brownouts due to the heat wave. It's also, drought conditions. There might be something for, let's do some exploratory activities, and maybe it's through workshops, maybe it's through some sort of scenario development that we do, and we look at what if what's happening right now in California happens in Colorado. What would happen if we, millions of people lost their access to electricity because we're in a drought or because we're in a heat wave? And so I think towards, Peter's point, catastrophes really help encourage people, but maybe we don't have to wait until Colorado has its next one, its own one, but we can build off what California is going through right now and say, how do we not become California?
Almost sounded like an historian speaking there, Jordan. I'm just going to pay you a huge compliment. That's something you might have expected this historian to say. So we are out of time, but I'm going to do one quick thing, which is ask all of you to say a quick yes or no as to whether you would like the Colorado Scientific Society to extend this program into the future in some way. And it could be another, I'm just feeling very frustrated that we only have this much time to chat among ourselves. So I'm thinking we better extend this, because otherwise I'll be talking to this cat back here about that issue, which isn't going to go well. So yes or no, and a very quick why for your answer. Do you think the Colorado Scientific Society should be encouraged to extend this whole initiative started with this 4-part series? So Elizabeth, there you are. Oh, muted, sorry, muted.
I would say absolutely. And I think one of the benefits that we can see from being online and through these Zoom is that there may be actually more access to programming like this to more people than we initially thought. And so I'm a yes.
Okay, good. So I'm just going in the order in which I can see you on my screen here. So Mark, yes or no?
Yes, unreservedly yes, because when you look at the energy water nexus, it's up there with all the most important things that our representatives in our communities discuss: education, transportation. Energy and water is as important or more important than those to our life.
Okay, so Russ, yes or no?
Absolutely. I'm excited by this, and particularly excited to look at the attendee list and not recognize all that many names. I think we succeed together. We need to broaden the tent, and anything that can help us get more people into the conversation is good.
Okay. Jordan, yes or no?
I would also go with an absolute yes. And I think for one primary reason, which is I think we're just starting on this conversation. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, our energy system is drastically changing, and our water system will also change as well, which means the relationships between those two, what we've studied historically, will be different from what we will see in 2030 and 2040 and 2050. And I think now is a great time to be starting and initiating these conversations, but we really need to stay on top of what's happening with technology developments in both the water and energy fields.
Great, thank you. So Peter.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that Colorado Scientific Society has the brain power, talent in there to facilitate this. And I think, as I've said several times, I think education is the most important thing we can be doing from our perspective to get the public on board with this, realize where we're heading.
Okay, great. So I have just one very quick concluding remark. I had a professor in college, Paige Smith, and he raised chickens, and he wrote a book about chickens with a co-author who was a biologist, and it was called The Chicken Book. And he raised his chickens in a very organic, those are the healthiest damn chickens anywhere. So he always said, he loved his chickens, and he would say, if we can make ourselves right with the chicken, we can make ourselves right with everything else that's gone wrong in the world. I'm not totally certain that he was right about that, but I so buy, and I did bring this rubber chicken for some reason I couldn't really remember, but I had this rubber chicken here to say, no, with the rubber chicken, or with the chicken, it's not making ourselves right with the chicken or really any other particular organism. It's what everyone has been saying here, making ourselves right with this energy water nexus. That's really it. And this is the rubber chicken that is gone now. We're just, whoops, hit the cat's water dish, whoops. So anyway, so now we hand off to Celine, who is going to pull together questions from our audience. And then Bob Reynolds, our principal organizer of this event, he and I will be up for the last 5 minutes of our time together. So Panelists, you were very cool. It's been really wonderful. Thank you for your company. And now Celine is also very cool, and she will take over.
Thank you so much, Patty. And yes, if our audience members want to keep submitting questions, we're going to be pulling from that. If we don't answer your question specifically, we're sorry. We do have so many wonderful questions, but put it in there anyway because it might be put into another theme that we might have. But one of the, I'd like to say that our audience agrees, yes to the question. We got a resounding amount of yeses in the chat, so thank you all so much. And one of the biggest themes that we've seen is this idea of education and how to make it more accessible. And I do agree with some of our audience members that say that Zoom is a great way of starting these conversations because they do make it accessible. With that in mind, we had a question early on in the chat about going into what decarbonization is. We were talking about using very industry specific terms. I think this might be one of them. So it's a great opportunity to make it accessible for all 100 and something of our audience members.
I'll take a shot at it.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Well, decarbonization is removing carbon dioxide generating energy sources from our energy mix. And so anytime we replace electricity made by coal or natural gas with a non or low greenhouse gas emitting energy source, that's considered decarbonization. And then we have what's called deep decarbonization, where we take and we move our energy systems from being mostly reliant on fossil fuels that generate carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, to energy sources that emit very, very little CO2 over their life cycle. And we really drastically reduce the amount of carbon that we emit into the atmosphere.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thinking about decarbonization and different forms of energy and water that are able to do that, can we talk a little bit more about hydro energy and about the possibility of using dams and reservoirs? So I think, Peter, this might be a good question for you to help us out on. But Jordan, I see you're also unmuted, so I'll give you both the opportunity to chime in on this. You can go ahead and start, Jordan.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's important to note that hydropower historically has been a very important source of electricity for the United States as a whole, as well as for Colorado. It has provided reliable electricity in many different contexts. And so it still remains an important source today as well as going forward. I think one of the challenges that hydropower faces is that siting and permitting of new projects can be quite challenging. And so we are likely to see some difficulty in permitting and establishing new large reservoirs and new large dams that can be used for electricity production. That being said, there are a lot of great opportunities for more distributed and decentralized hydropower systems. So inline hydropower is a good example. Another great opportunity is to repower existing dams or dams that maybe do not have power generating capabilities right now. We can upgrade the current systems or add power generating stations to those reservoirs. But an important caveat that I think is really important to note is that in many cases, we are seeing a change in the role that hydropower is playing in our grid. So more traditionally, hydropower has been providing what we'll call base load. So it's providing electricity 24 hours a day, that constant reliable electricity. What we're seeing, especially in the last 5 and 10 years, is that the role of hydropower has transitioned from that base load constant production to more ramping up and down and providing flexible generation, largely to accommodate the onset of variable wind and solar technologies onto the grid. Hydropower is incredible and incredibly useful at being flexible and ramping up and down quickly, doing it much more effectively than, let's say, coal or nuclear power plants can do. And so we have seen the role of hydropower just changing from providing electricity all day long to more just ramping up and down to provide that needed energy storage and energy flexibility that we really need in the grid.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to add anything to that?
I think he covered it quite well. Just a sidebar to it, since hydropower is surface water from groundwater, we're looking at aquifer storage and recovery systems where we inject water into aquifers and then pump it out. There is effort into looking at generating power through the pumps that you use for extracting. So it's kind of the same thing as this pump storage using reservoirs, surface reservoirs, but you can do that. And so it's a future technology to consider.
Thank you. And one of the recurring questions that we've got in the chat has to do with the barriers, no pun intended, that exist for being able to access this kind of energy. So one of the questions that we got was surrounding water pacts with surrounding states, and even just other local government barriers that prevent this from being able to be a little more streamlined. Again, forgive the pun. Would any of our panelists like to talk about what is a water pact? How do we have to, how are we able to section off something that is a shared resource for different populations and different needs?
I can take a stab at it. We are a headwater state. We have multiple compacts with other states or groups of states, along with decrees that basically essentially dictate the amount of water that will be delivered outside of Colorado and the agreements between those. There's a lot of factors that are locked into that. Energy can be one, water quality can be one, environmental concerns. So I guess I don't know that it's overall, it is a constraining factor for sure, but there's a lot that we can still do within that framework. There are examples of, projects that they're envisioning just in the South Platte Basin here, where it's, maybe how can we better utilize our resources to supply and really benefit agriculture, the environment, municipal needs, speaking to what Elizabeth talked about, the kind of very hot growth in this region. How can we be better with the resources we have and still meet our compact obligations? So within that are many opportunities for any number of things, including energy. I don't know that it ties our hands completely. It is certainly something that we have to operate in legally.
Thank you, Russ. Elizabeth, would you like to chime in with anything there? Awesome. So one of the other recurring themes that we're seeing is different technologies and the roles of different technologies. I would love to hear a little bit more from Peter about underground storage of CO2, as well as, we've talked a little bit about new technologies in the nuclear sector, but what the possibilities are moving forward with those.
Well, there's been a fair amount of work looking at injecting carbon dioxide into deep saline aquifers. You have to find the right setting to do it. And it would be near a power plant in a geologic setting that will allow you to get the carbon dioxide in and know that it's not going to escape. And that takes quite a bit of detailed geologic characterization. There's been a pilot study up outside of Craig that we were involved with doing that. It can happen. There are deep aquifers throughout the state. It's one of those, you have to have it in the right place, close to a power plant. Whether it'll happen in the future, I don't know the crystal ball on that. So, now what was the rest of the question?
It was just surrounding any, what the possibilities for the use of these new technologies is.
Another thing to add onto the carbon capture and storage challenge, I agree with all the geological challenges that Peter mentioned, and it's a great area of future research for any budding geologists out there, is also that there is a water impact of doing that sort of carbon capture and storage as well. So it could be anywhere from a 50% to 100% increase in the water requirements of those power plants if they want to fit in those carbon capture technologies. And so we want to talk about the links between energy, water, and climate. If we are going to try to capture that CO2, it may come with a water penalty.
Thank you, Jordan. No, I absolutely agree. And I think going back to something that we were talking about earlier, we were talking about the role of education in just educating the population. One of the things that came in through the chat was the idea that when science presents new information, it's oftentimes questioned because it changes. Science is, it's not an exact science. It's one of the things that we get new information and we adapt our theories and we adapt our assumptions. So what can be the role of institutions, organizations, or even individuals in giving information, regaining, and not just regaining trust, but getting trust to begin with and being able to disseminate this information to different channels?
Well, I think this goes back a little bit to our discussion before, right? About what kind of scientists and what sort of interactions should the scientists have with the public. And I think a really important thing for the public to understand is that science is a way of knowing about the world around us by experimenting, by trying things and making ideas about what happened based on those results. And sometimes our ideas are right on the money and sometimes they're not all the way there yet, right? Or even occasionally just outright wrong. And you know, it's not so much a matter of trusting or not trusting the scientists, but it's more a matter of understanding what's going on as we try and get more and more certain about what is happening and why. And so, I mean, I think that's a real place that we have to push, is just for people to understand what's going on in the culture of being a scientist or an engineer.
I'll just add in a little bit, and it kind of tags into some of the other stuff that we were talking about earlier, is that I think being able to clearly state things in English rather than in scientific jargon is really important. Also, I think putting out your assumptions are really important so that people can clearly say, okay, their scientific assumption was this that led to this, so that they can clearly understand where things are going. And I know certainly in our office, that's, you know, some of the big things that we try to do, because we're creating these population estimates and forecasts for program planning across the board, whether it's transportation, water, energy, to make sure people understand what it's based on, and then how those things can change. And so in our office, that's what we've been trying to do, is show the connections, especially between the economy and population growth and housing units, that there is this clear relationship. And if jobs change, you can make some assumptions in terms of what's going to be happening with the population as well. So I think that all of us can work on communicating better and, you know, but not dumbing it down too much at all, or being, you know, not respectful in the way that we talk about things, but also the importance of it also coming from a political framework, I think is really important as well, to understand where it's coming from.
Could I just go in for a moment here, that I do think specialization has been wonderful in generating knowledge and understanding, wonderful, but then it went too far. So every time that specialists from every imaginable area, when they get together, that's a great place to practice communication with the public. And that's why I think I have had a charmed life as a humanities person, hanging out with people who are scientists and engineers, is that I represent the American public a great share of the time, because people will say things to me and I'll think, what? And as a person, I do have a PhD, woohoo, I do, and it does me no good. And so I feel that empowered experts who are quite willing to be acknowledging themselves as ignoramuses in conversations with other experts, that could absolutely transform this whole scene. If you mix people up and they cannot speak comfortably in their familiar language because there is a PhD carrying ignoramus in their midst, I think that just has a very refreshing effect. So every time we have any occasion to enter a cocktail party, go find the people who do things that are arcane to you. It seems like experts among themselves can do a lot of rehearsing for what to do when they get to the general public. And that does not happen, I'm sorry to say, when a bunch of historians go to a convention. Not so good. Sometimes the people in the elevators will chat with us. That's very good, but that's about it for crossing out. So anyway, there's a human resources pool there that is huge if we just mobilize that. Thanks.
I absolutely agree. I think there's a lot of value in pausing and acknowledging what you don't know. And I think that's the most relatable thing. I also think that programs such as this are a great opportunity for us to practice that communication, because we're not sitting across the table from each other awkwardly, waiting for the next opportunity to speak. So it's a great exercise in listening as well.
Thank you.
So I do have one more question that I'm pulling from the comments, and it's a little more complicated. I'll say this with the caveat that we have about 5 minutes left for this portion of the discussion. But I'd like to know what how one balances the needs of the population when it comes to water needs with the environmental needs. I mean, we're in Colorado. We have such a great diversity of those two there, especially relating to energy and resources. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from any of our fabulous panelists about what recommendations we have in regards to that balance, or what lessons we have learned, even if we don't have the answers.
I'll jump in here. I mean, this is kind of the central struggle we deal with every day. I feel, you know, hearkening back to something Peter said, I think one of the brilliances of the roundtables is just getting people to talk. I mean, what I have heard stories from that are almost, in my mind, a little, it's just surprising, but even within one basin, people saying that they didn't like a person from another side of the basin, but once they came together and they could understand their point of view, they kind of got where they were coming from. And that goes too, I've heard, you know, farmers say, like, you know, in my mind, it didn't matter if there was water in the stream, you know, I was going to take it, but now I've changed and I understand that. Like, I don't think we can ever underestimate the power of people just seeing each other, understanding each other's perspective. I think it's critical to success, but certainly the only way we succeed as a state, I think, is by raising up all of these areas together. You know, people that are, you know, supposedly anti-environment are also the same people that are hunting and fishing and using our watersheds. There is value there, inherent value. That's also true the other way. The agriculture in the state is a huge piece of the economy. There are many jobs that are supported. And then, of course, our cities provide a huge economic base and innovation. We need all of these things to succeed, and we have to have people talking to see each other's perspective and make smart decisions that don't disproportionately impact one another or have unintended consequences.
Thank you, Russ. Do we have any other opinions from our fabulous panel? And again, we might not have all of the answers right now, but I think acknowledging that the conversation is the next step is great. And I love hearing a Zoom call full of scientists that all believe that that communication and conversations is the way that we're able to resolve some of our issues. Elizabeth, what do you think?
You know, it's interesting. I'm not a demographer, actually. I'm an economist. And so what you're always doing is weighing alternatives. And certainly this has always been an issue with the water population, and I'm sure it goes the same way with energy and population as well. You know, you have to kind of think about why areas were first created and what drew people to Colorado and created who we are, but then at the same time weigh it against those resources. And I know I've been in plenty of places talking about like the slowdown in population. They're like, thank God we don't need you. And it's like, well, but it's also important to understand what I would call, there's a whole new area, it's called strategic shrinkage. Because the United States is slowing down, and even though we're still forecasting Colorado to increase by about 2 million people, and we'll need more resources. This is much slower than we were before, and it's how do we do it well? And there are different signals that will be out there. Certainly price is a huge signal, and as water's gotten more expensive, Even though it's relatively cheap in Colorado, as it's gotten more expensive, it's made housing more expensive. And because housing is more expensive, it's making Colorado less attractive. And so if we use even price as an indicator, to use that weighing population to water, let's say, it is a signal that's out there that has been, we don't like it necessarily, but it is pushing, that's one of the reasons Colorado's slowing down, is that it is not as competitive as other states. But then the question is, you still have these low wage workers. You still need, you're not going to be able to automate everything. And where is that low wage worker going to live if housing is exorbitant? So we still have to deal with these issues.
And I would want to jump in. I think those are really great points. And I think this concept of price or of cost or of valuing, the water resources is absolutely essential. And I think this, I think, Elizabeth, you gave a great example with the price of water as it affects housing development, but we can also think about the value that having clean water just provides. And when we think about things like the people using our outdoors, hunting, fishing, whatever it might be, we have less sophisticated tools and less sophisticated ways of actually quantifying that value, because some of it can be, put in monetary terms, but not all of it. And I think that's an area that remains a challenge, because it's very easy to quantify the dollar value of a gas reservoir, natural gas reservoir. That's very easy to quantify, but the water that fills our rivers and streams and provides other services, we still have a lot to do in improving how we're valuing that, such that it can be on that similar level as you just did with the price of water for housing development. We need to do something similar as it relates to the environmental, ecological value of that.
Thank you. And we're right about that time, so I will go ahead and pass the microphone to Patty and Bob. Thank you to our panelists.
I'll take it. If there's a minute or two left, I'll take it. Otherwise, I think people have had a chance to hear my range of thoughts, which really are so much focused on gratitude to the panelists and to the great recruitment of the panelists, which, if we're going to speak of the great recruitment of the panelists, then Bob Reynolds is the next person to hear from, because he was the one who all of these people got pulled into this excellent world by getting a message from Bob Reynolds, right? So here's Bob to bring us into a port. And if there is a minute or two at the end, I'll take it. Otherwise.
No, certainly. Thank you, Patty. And again, thank you all panelists, and thank you, Celine, and the team at the Denver Museum. And this has really been a team effort between the Colorado Scientific Society and the Center of the American West and the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So we're grateful to all people who helped pull this together. I did want to take an opportunity here at the very end to sort of wrap up the forum, and I'm going to really highlight what I think are a couple of fundamental patterns that we're experiencing and that are going on around us. And it's going to arc back to Jeff Ling's presentation from Excel at the beginning of the program, and it'll harken to some you just heard. But we're in the midst of an energy transformation that is profound and global. And this concept of decarbonization, taking away the carbon input from our electricity and transportation sectors, is a global phenomenon. You're going to hear more and more about electric cars. There's an electric Cessna airplane. It's the size of a Cessna. It's cheaper to purchase than a regular gasoline-powered airplane. And you're going to see the same thing with cars. The electric cars are going to be cheaper than regular cars in the very near future. And there's going to be a fundamental transformation in the way we use energy to both generate electricity and to do transportation. The second fundamental change that's happening globally, and certainly here in Colorado, is we're in a transition time in our water use, going from agriculture towards municipal use. And many of you in Colorado will have heard stories about the trans-mountain water diversions and the utilization of that water. And there's a lot of data indicating that what used to be used for irrigation, for example, for sugar beets up here in the area where I live in Longmont, is now being used for municipal use. So there's a tremendous transition going on right now in terms of how we're using water. And we had an earlier panelist talk about the fact we have to change the way we consider grass, both in terms of lawns and for cows. And that's one of the things that's happening is we're looking at our consumption of meat. We've got a variety of alternatives to meat that are coming up, and that will influence the pattern of agriculture in Colorado, particularly if we start to use less of our water for growing food for animals and transfer it to municipal use. So these two issues, these two large-scale fundamental issues of decarbonization, changing our energy infrastructure, changing our water infrastructure, come together here in this forum and in some of the discussions we've just had, and Jordan's brought it up a couple of times, that we're going to need to consider our infrastructure, and we're going to have to plan for a changing infrastructure going forward, because we want to have equitable and affordable clean water and clean energy for our population. And that's not just a Colorado issue, that's a national issue, and of course the global issue. And I'll quickly point out that many countries around the world are facing these problems, and I've done a lot of work in the Middle East looking at water and water usage, and there's some fantastic technologies that are being developed in areas where water shortages are profoundly more severe than we have here in the United States or in Colorado. And one of the great pleasures that we have as scientists and as citizens, informed citizens, is that we can watch the interplay of these knowledges being brought around the world. And the internet, of course, provides instant communication at the speed of light across the world. So ideas that are brought up in one place can be moved across the globe instantaneously. And I think that museums like the Denver Museum of Nature and Science are some of the forefront organizations that can help present this kind of information to the public in a language, again, to echo some of our comments here a few minutes ago, in a language that can be understood by the people. And if we don't speak in language that can be understood by the people, what are the values of our words? So Patty, I'll ask you to reflect on that and again, to bring us home.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And those were great comments, Bob. And I'm just going to say that two things. I'm going to say that I have designed for myself the most thought-provoking lifestyle. Other people my age have to do crossword puzzles to keep their minds nimble and active and so on. Not me, because I hang out in too many circles. And so in this case, I guess I will have to say that I have hung out quite a bit. Not have to, I want to say that I've hung out with the Colorado cattlemen. I've written the introduction to the new book celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, which has had an enormous impact in preserving landscapes of beauty in Colorado. So I'm not sure I'm particularly fond of a cow. Fine with a hamburger, but I am really, really fond of a number of ranchers. So because of my ridiculous lifestyle, where I seem to have come into a zone of affection with everybody under the sun, including nuclear affiliated people. So you're not my first rodeo on this one here for that. So I just feel like I am pleasantly and I hope positively tormented by the fact that all of the constituencies involved, I feel as if I know some of those folks, and I would be hard put to return to the company of the cattlemen if I didn't say, I don't know, there's a lot of landscape value in those. They're the open space stewards in many ways in this region. We de-water their lands or well, anyway, so there's just that. Then the second thing I wanted to say is that as an historian, the most nightmarish outcome of having people consider history is often encapsulated in that statement, well, if we don't know history, we're condemned to repeat it. History, the movement of human beings through time and space, it's not a Ferris wheel. It's not a carousel. It's not that it just repeats around and around and around, because boy, that would make for an interesting field of study if all we did was just see the same things repeat over and over. It doesn't happen. So sadly, that is the line usually used to cheerlead for history. If we don't study it, we're going to be condemned to repeat it. And it is a distortion of what actually history is. So it's really hard when your best champions, many lovable people have said to me, well, I'm glad you're an historian, because it's like that old saying, if you don't study history, you're, no, don't say that to me anymore, but please say that if you ever need to say that to me. And recognize that the real point of histories and the study of history is to see what we actually had introduced. Enough attention to probability, let's look at improbability. Let's look at contingency. Let's look at all the way that the study of history is an anti-inevitability delivery device. So that's what I would like to end with, is that the very, very worst thing that can happen to a human being well, short of disease and injury and so on, is a sense of despair and resignation and the inaction that comes from that. So everything that I have heard from all of the presenters in this session and from our organizer is just perfect for saying, skip the part about inevitability, resignation, and despair and figure out what we might do. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. All four parts of this series will be available on the DMNS YouTube. So feel free to catch up on parts 1 and 2, which I believe are already up. But thank you all so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, Bob and Patty.